Hey, Guopher here! Another 3 weeks have passed and another Crisis Hair we love is being released. If you haven't done the latest story, just know that Cypher is the GOAT, but today we'll see if she's the GOAT gameplay-wise. I'll be explaining her kit in depth as well as showing some gameplay optimizations. Then it's on to Eidolon and build calculations that I've done for you guys today. Full value and team synergies will be up at the end. If you like my guides, be sure to like and subscribe for more, and now let's begin. So Cypher is a quantum nihility unit, but not our first. We have a wolf and a cat now. This cat is very fast and has a nice amount of attack, but she is a little fragile at the same time. Funnily enough, you could technically ignore her traces, or at least not max them out, as her true power comes from bonus abilities as well as fixed, unchanging values in her core abilities. But if going for damage, you want to focus on her talent and skill, followed by her ultimate. Now onto those abilities. She is playable in the recent event, but there is nuance to how her kit works, and I'll probably explain how everything functions. First off, her talent. The way it works is she will apply the Patron state to an enemy. This happens automatically at the start of combat, applied to the highest max HP enemy, so the target that needs to die the most. Similarly to Topaz, she can choose where this state goes using her skill, but she can also do it using her ultimate, applied to the central target of these abilities. The Patron state only works on the most recent target, so make sure to put it on someone who'll be taking most of your damage. When the Patron state is on a target, two things will happen. First, if they're attacked by any other ally, Cypher will perform a follow-up attack. This will trigger once a turn and resets when Cypher takes a turn, so a follow-up every turn of hers. The other thing that will happen is that Cypher will tally 12% of the damage dealt to the Patron. In reality, she tallies more, but we'll see that later. The damage she records, however, cannot be true damage to avoid infinitely ramping damage, but also cannot be overflow damage, so damage that goes past 0 HP on an enemy. But what do we do with this recorded damage? Well, that's the ultimate's job. She'll deal damage to one enemy and then deal 25% of her recorded damage in her talent to this enemy as true damage. Then she attacks the central enemy and adjacent enemies and deals 75% of the recorded damage in her talent as true damage to all three enemies distributed equally. Basically, a blast attack formation. If you attack a central enemy, they will receive 50% and adjacent enemies 25%. If you attack one of two enemies, it will be 62.5% on one, 37.5% on the other. If you attack one enemy, all of it goes onto them. So if it's just a big boss, you'll want to ideally clear their side enemies before ulting on Cypher in order to slam dunk 100% of your recorded damage onto them and them alone. The ult is separated into two parts, the 25% recorded damage, then the distributed 75%, so you can actually game the system an ult and kill a side enemy, and let all the distributed 75% go onto the boss. But I'd rather just kill that side enemy and get 100% on the boss instead. But all in all, combining her talent and ult, basically your whole team can do damage and she will record a percentage of it, and she'll be able to unleash this later. No, this does not mean she's Powercreep Proof, because she can scale with and buff your OP version 4.x team that does 10 billion damage. It's legit just another way of giving a true damage buff, though this is still very strong as true damage is rare, and is accounting for the whole team unlike RMC. But you hold on to the damage gains rather than immediately applying it. You'll see a big damage number, but that big damage number is just the gains you get over the duration of the fight. For example, if she records 12% of the team damage and can redistribute it later, that's kind of just like amplifying team damage by 12%. It's not the exact same, and that's what makes her interesting, but we'll talk more about this later. The rest of Cypher's abilities are just little bonuses. Her skill is a blast attack that will weaken all targets, decreasing their damage dealt by 10%. A bit of survivability help, nothing special though. She also gets a small attack buff of 30%. It's a bit of a shame that her skill doesn't do more, but her technique is pretty fun. She'll be undetectable by enemies and you go super fast, but when going near enemies you can gain a random consumable as if you're stealing from their pockets. This has a limit, but hey, free trick snacks. When entering battle, she'll deal a little damage and record as if it did double, but that's nothing special either. So when does she get awesome? Well, unfortunately her bonus abilities hide her actual kit. Her A2 will give her buffs based on speed thresholds, buffing her crit rate and her gained tally for her talent. At 170 speed, you'll get a 50% crit rate buff and a 2 times tally multiplier. And don't worry, 170 isn't hard to hit on her. The tally multiplier essentially means instead of recording 12% of the damage dealt to the patron, we'll now record 24%. This is so much better. And then, A4 will tally 8% of the damage dealt by allies to enemy targets other than the patron. thankfully. With the A2, this is 16%. So you deal damage to the whole field. 24% done to the Patron is taken, 16% done to any other enemies is also taken. Before we talk about why and how the tally is awesome, let's finish Traces. In her A6, she gets a mighty buff to her follow-up attack, and then you get a permanent 40% vulnerability to all enemies when Cypher is on the field. Yes, this is a bonus ability for some reason, and is pretty amazing. In a vacuum, you can consider this a 1.4 times damage amp to your whole team's damage, or a 1.07 times better tribute ult in damage amp without needing any ult uptime or anything. It's just there, it stays through waves and all. Combined with her recorded damage and at E0S0, she will have a pretty undiluted damage amp of 1.64 times to 1.74 times for your whole team permanently. And finally, she gets a crazy 14 speed in bonuses, on top of some damage boost and effect hit rate. But now onto that tally. She records damage done, and because she redistributes it, you can kind of think this as Triby's Eidolon 1, except sometimes weaker but sometimes stronger, and it's much more versatile in general. Triby E1 takes 24% of your whole attack and redistributes it onto the highest HP enemy. This can in theory, but not really in practice, increase your single target damage from an AoE attack versus 5 enemies by 120%. Compared to Cypher instead, when she records all your damage from an AoE attack onto 5 enemies, and only the boss remains, and you Cypher them for 100% true damage, your single target damage would increase by 88%. This is just for comparison's sake, as we record more than just that DPS's attack, and we won't ult all the time, but your damage will always be recorded. But despite having similar functions, they're still quite different. This is because Cypher gets to keep the damage as well as redistribute it to up to 3 enemies. Keeping the damage can sometimes be stronger because of overkill. If Triby E1 buffs my damage, but I was going to clear within that cycle breakpoint anyway, then Triby E0 would have done the same thing. However, replacing said Triby E1's effect with Cypher means we instead get a different scenario, provided again they clear wave 1 at the same cycle. Triby E1 buffs your damage overall by 24% and your single target damage depending on the enemy count. Cypher's talent does not buff your damage immediately, so you can instead save all this excess damage you might not need and use it to frontload damage on wave 2, or you can keep on saving it. Cypher will then record damage from wave 2 just like Triby E1 would boost it, but you'd also get the stored damage from wave 1, doubling the potential power. Frontloading all that damage from wave 1 is immense, but it's just strong in general for multi-phase bosses. You do all that damage from wave 1, phase 1, and then Cypher ult nukes their phase 2 regardless of what the mechanics say. But what about the multiple enemies part? Say we have a single target DPS and a blast DPS and we versus 2 elites. Triby E1 is very simple here, it would boost my single target damage by 24%. On the blast DPS, I'm probably hitting the side enemy for half of my multiplier, so Triby E1 boosts the overall damage by 24%, but my single target damage by 36%. Cypher recording damage will record 24% damage to the central enemy, 16% to the side enemy. She will distribute 62.5% to the central enemy, 37.5% to the side enemy. Again, this is just for comparison's sake as we won't be using Cypher ult non-stop. On my single target DPS, I would go an overall damage gain of 24%, but 15% of that is going to the single target enemy. And now I'm getting damage on the other enemy despite being a single target DPS. She helps single target DPS in Blast, like E1 Triby helps AoE DPS in single target, but Cypher can also help AoE DPS in a similar way. As for the Blast DPS, I would get an overall damage gain of 21.3%, but I would specifically get a 20% single target damage increase, as well as a 24% damage increase on the side enemy. So it has more potential for multiple chunky enemies rather than just a solo one. But anyways, that's just comparisons, and again, Cypher gets to hold on to everything. Why is this good? You'll have moments where your damage drops a ton. That could be the case for units that have a damage profile skewed to one ability or an enhanced state, like Acheron waiting for an ultimate, or Jingliu outside of her spectral state. In between those high damage actions, you're not doing much. If you had a different damage amp in place of Cypher, you'd still have to wait for that ultimate or next state to deal significant damage again, and maybe it will take the next cycle to do so. Even if the support were a bit stronger than Cypher, it's looking at 3 strong ults versus 3 slightly weaker ults, but then recorded damage of all those ults exactly when you want it. You get to choose when your damage gains come to fruition. But also the fight can change, and maybe the boss has damage reduction mechanics. Bye-bye damage, but Cypher's stored damage from before these mechanics appeared is still present, and remember, she shoots it out as true damage, which ignores any resistances. Furthermore, if the Apocalyptic Shadow has mechanics like Kafka's one where you want to kill side enemies, then E1 Tribute putting all your damage gains onto Kafka isn't helping you break any faster. Finally, this is a bit niche but may see some use in some highly optimized fights, but her being able to hold onto her ult for when you actually need it means you can use Quid Pro Quo to an even greater effect. Now, when your Abundance unit starts their turn, you'd only have 2 allies it can land on, immense for battering specific supports or a main carry. Anyways, that's all the intricacies and pros of her talent. I hope you enjoyed the yap, but I think most people probably skipped to the relic section by now. But now let's check out Eidolons before we get to the build section ourselves. E1 will multiply our recorded damage by 1.5 times the original value. That sounds super strong, but remember it's 1.5 times of 0.24 times or 0.16 times, and so overall, it's not the biggest gain. She then gets a mega attack buff, boosting her sub DPS power. E2 gives her a 2-turn 30% vulnerability debuff on attacks now. She can't hit AoE, so it's not perfect, and it's saturated a bit from her A6, but it's quite a nice buff nonetheless. E4 will then give her some damage procs whenever the patron target is attacked. I would have actually enjoyed seeing this in the base kit. And finally, E6 will increase her follow-ups damage percent by a whopping 350%, so you get mini nukes every turn now, and your follow-ups will also be recorded at a higher percentage than any other attack. But the real source is that when you ult, you get to keep 20% of the tally you accumulated, making damage appear out of thin air. Here are my Eidolon calculations for overall team damage gain for a Cypher in an Acheron team, but her Eidolons are all kind of universal, so it'd be similar in other teams. So what about builds? Cypher does decent damage for support, but compared to recent monsters like Tribi and Hyacinth in AoE, she's not doing all that much. That big damage number on her ult is recorded damage, and that is barely affected by her build outside of getting to 170 speed. So, to be honest, her build is not the biggest priority. You don't need to farm 30 crit value pieces or anything. Anyways, for her sets, you can first opt for 2 6% speed relic sets if you just want to go for that speed threshold of 170. The overall team damage won't be affected too badly, and you can use those double crit pieces you got whilst farming for supports. Furthermore, if you pull E0S0 Cypher, she doesn't have a free-to-play friendly speed icon like Hyacinth does to achieve her threshold. For damage, you can go for Pioneer or Genius, but you'd want her S1 if so. First, for the speed, but also for consistent debuffs for Pioneer or Death Shred stacking for Genius. Your Planars can be Glamoth, since she goes over the 160 threshold, but Izimo or Duran or even in a Salsoto also work. Izimo in an Acheron team, Duran in a Feixiao team. Just go with whatever you have best stats-wise. But another option is to forego her damage slightly and boost your main carry with the Lushaka set, or Penacony for quantum DPS. This is better than going for her own damage in the case that you have a well-invested carry. Your main stats will want to be Crit Chest, maybe EHR if running Resolution, Speed Boots always, Damage or Attack Orb, and then Attack or Energy Rope. Since she can hold onto her ult for when you actually need it, getting to energy breakpoints is not always necessary, but if you want her to ult spam, for example to battery your DPS and or abuse the Eagle set, then use that energy rope. And for the orb, if you want to run Sustainless easier, I recommend a HP orb. She is very squishy. And so for a stat goal first, grab that 170 speed. With speed boots alone and her traces you hit 145 speed, requiring 25 speed in subsets to hit the breakpoint. This is why I recommend 2-piece speed combos if you don't have her S1, as that would bring her to nearly 160 without any substats. You'll also want to meet her EHR threshold, and that will be 39%. If using the Resolution Light Cone, you might want to get to 67%. Then for crit rate, aim for 50% so we can cap it with her bonus ability, and crit damage can be something like 170 thanks to the crit damage chest. Her attack can be somewhere around 2.3 to 2.8k. If you want to go for a higher speed breakpoint, 200 is the next big thing usually, and very hard to achieve for her. For other breakpoints, it would depend on Eagle set or dance procs in the team. But one simple one anyone can go for with S1 Cypher is 180 with Robin in the team, as 180 speed units can act 3 times during Concerto, as we can lap the 90 speed countdown twice now. So I spoke about her S1 a bunch, but what does it do? Well, her signature is actually a universal and potent cone. We get an immediate 18% speed buff, just like Hyacinth's signature, but Nihility doesn't have any free speed cones like Remembrance does. Then you get a 120% chance to apply a 16% def reduction. 120% chance only requires 39% EHR to guarantee. If your speed is higher than 170, you inflict a separate but additive def reduction of 8%. So 18% speed and 24% def reduction on a low EHR threshold. It's like resolution but 5-star. And not only is it better in stats, but it also lasts 2 turns instead of 1. This means you no longer would have to worry about enemies acting in between your debuffer and your DPS. The speed threshold isn't even hard to hit since we're building debuffers for 160 speed anyway, and that 18% speed buff would get them to 170 without even changing your build. And finally, you can reapply the debuff even if you act twice in succession, unlike resolution. This means when using Cypher with Acheron, basic into follow-up will generate 2/stream rather than just 1 with resolution. It's a fantastic light cone. You could pull it without pulling Cypher to be honest, as it stacks fantastically with Silver Wolf or Pellet's def reduction, and I'd recommend this over E1 if investing into Cypher. Remember though, it's just a cone and 3.4 is here soon. For other light cones, her only real options are Resolution Shines and Tutorial. And Tutorial specifically would need a source of allied def reduction work as she provides none herself. Resolution's uptime is wonky and can't be reapplied as said earlier, so its Acheron battery potential is weaker. For applying a debuff on her basic ult and follow-up, the only other ways to do so would be Kafka and Acheron Sigs, but yeah. So what about teams? Where can I use her? Her recorded damage is around a 17.6 to 24% true damage amplification, except for the fact that it's for the whole team unlike RMC, and she gets to choose when exactly to dish out the damage gains. Then she has a 40% amp permanently from her vulnerability in the A6. Technically, she has a high damage amp than Tribi E0, though she lacks the high AoE damage Tribi can output as well as the dance factor. If you pull Cypher S1, she then gets a nice 24% def shred, around a 15% damage amp in a vacuum. If you stick to resolution, it will be around 9%, but with a much weaker uptime. So with that being said, she offers substantial supporting power and it works for your whole team versus all enemies with 0 downtime. Consistency is really nice and underrated quality to have. Furthermore, she lets you choose when exactly you want to expend part of your damage gains, which is much more versatile in some cases than your standard damage amplification. She seems flexible and strong with 2 very rare multipliers. Her base amp is really good as a secondary or third buffer. Just remember that you aren't getting part of her amp until you ult. You can run her with your Anaxa, you can run her with an E1 Aglaya, you can run her with your Doctor Ratio. Any team where you have lots of advance like Sunday -1 setups can also use her nicely due to permanent amp uptime. Just like Tribi, DPS that self-buff a ton will appreciate Cypher's rarer multipliers. HP scalers won't mind her too, she doesn't give anything they wouldn't want. And those multi-DPS comps will appreciate a multi-DPS buffer. You could plop her anywhere you currently plop a Tribi except for where Tribi has extra synergies with the DPS. For example with the Herter, Tribi's more frequent and fully AoE attacks are more useful than Cypher's single target follow-ups. If there are fewer enemies on the field, Cypher E0's superior damage amp can overtake Tribi as she would now fall off damage-wise. The problem is, dance may let your team take a whole new rotation, and if that is the case, it's kinda irreplaceable. So I don't really know if you need to pull her if you have Tribi, maybe you could for another team, and Tribi's E1 is much stronger when looking at vertical investment. With Silver Wolf's buffs coming in 3.4, if you're unsure about whether you want Cypher as a generalist support, I would recommend waiting till Silver Wolf's buffs are revealed through the livestream or creative videos, as they should hopefully appear before Cypher's banner leaves. The main 2 DPS you'd pull Cypher for right now are Acheron and Feixiao, and Acheron players might also want to wait for Silver Wolf's reveal. But why does she synergize with these 2 better than others? If I have time, I plan on making a detailed video on Cypher versus Topaz and Jiao Cho, but for now let's summarize the best bits. For Feixiao, you have Cypher's high speed and attack frequency leading to 2 guaranteed attacks a turn with a high amount of turns. Cypher's 40% permanent vulnerability is way more consistent than Topaz's 50% vulnerability that is specifically on a single target and has to keep swapping. It is also universal, not restricted to follow-ups, which means you are amplifying your Feixiao skill damage now, Robin or Tribi's damage now, as well as your sustains damage, not to mention the damage recording on top. And all of this also goes for Doctor Ratio compositions. At equal investment, Cypher will just be out Topaz, but even with Cypher lacking an S1 or an E1 versus Topaz, I still prefer Cypher. The thing is, if you have a highly invested Topaz already, I don't think you'll need to pull Cypher, and Moz is already better than Topaz at maximum ceiling anyway. For Acheron, you ideally want S1 on Cypher to ensure her attacks will always generate a slash dream. With Resolution, you have a lot of chances to miss out on debuff applications as it cannot reapply itself, and Resolution is just generally weaker. Not to mention the EHR needs and the speed needs which can make Cypher's personal damage drop. With S1, she is now a very consistent debuff generator for Acheron, as well as already being very consistent in damage amp. I also really like her recorded damage for Acheron as she is ultra light, and Cypher being able to frontload a bunch of damage when you need it helps reduce the time in between big bursts. But yeah, I praise Xiaoqiu for his consistent damage amp, but Cypher's is legit just permanent, and flexible, and stronger at equal investment. And I praised Xiaoqiu for his high debuff generation, but Cypher E0S1 also generates a ton, and is always consistent, even if she can't generate as much as Xiaoqiu in his peak conditions. Which of the two is better can vary on game state and maybe teams, but generally at E0S1 on both, Cypher takes the win. But what if? It will. Who knows why when Xiaoqiu was supposed to be the Acheron support, though one thing to note is Cypher is not a reliable character to calculate. She cannot record overflow damage, which you can't realistically simulate. Then her recorded damage is subject to when you ult, which is very gameplay based and not really relevant in how most sheets work, and then Acheron in general is a bit finicky with ult thresholds. But she does sheet better than Xiaoqiu because she's hard to realistically sheet, and in practice, she worked out better than Xiaoqiu as well. Not to mention that you can now run Trend on the preservation if not using Xiaoqiu, which can generate a ton of stacks, though subject to RNG. If you're an E2 Acheron gamer and don't have Xiaoqiu or Silverwolf, Cypher's a fantastic pickup. If you have Xiaoqiu E0S1 already, or maybe Silverwolf, Cypher E0S1 is an upgrade, but is it worth the pulls when it won't change that much? And if you're an E0 Acheron enjoyer, you now have 3 cakes: Silverwolf, Xiaoqiu, and Cypher to choose from. You don't need to compare Xiaoqiu to Cypher when you can just run them both, as all 3 of them are way ahead of Pella and Guinaifen in debuff generation, amp, and consistency. If you only have one of the 3 between the wolf, the cat, and the fox, and you're sticking to E0 Acheron, I think Cypher is still an awesome pull and will elevate your Acheron's performance, and that's even at E0S0. But let me know what you think of Cypher. I think she could be an underrated gem as a high optimization unit, but there is an insane 3.4 patch coming very soon, so I understand if people want to save. Like and sub if you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching. Thanks to my amazing YouTube members, and have a Guoba day.